Welcome to American Streets, a podcast for street photographers. I'm your host, Thomas Anderson. In this edition of American Streets, I want to talk about what Edouard Manet can teach us about street photography. But you say, wait, wasn't he a painter? That's right, he was, but I've chosen him because he had the knack for capturing fantastic street images. Now that's a neat trick. How is the painted image going to happen on the street? Simple. Manet didn't set up his easel. He sketched from memory, then painted the image in his studio. Now that takes real genius and a great eye. That's what Manet will teach us, how to train our eye so well we capture great photographs. As I hope you will see, great painting and great street photographs are all based on a genius for seeing. But Manet liked to say he painted not from sight, but from insight. What he really meant was that he could see the image and its meaning at the same time. I believe the best street photographers have this gift. Now, Manet was a 19th century French painter who mentored young painters who identified themselves eventually as Impressionists, but he never went by that label and never showed his work in their exhibitions. The Impressionists were more concerned with light and color. With the direction Manet was to take in his painting, he did not want to be associated with an avant-garde movement. Besides, he was going to break some rules. But before we zero in on how Manet influenced the 19th century art world and influenced later street photographers, let's look at how the Impressionist movement affected the wider world of photography. Impressionism and photography are the most important innovations in 19th century visual art, but both struggled to achieve critical acceptance for different reasons. Photography took off like a rocket. A fairly easy, rote process anyone could learn, daguerreotypes were an instant commercial success, replacing the more expensive, small cameo paintings so popular with the public. As a result, there was a huge demand. Photography studios sprouted on almost every major street in Paris, London, and New York. But serious art critics rejected photography, calling it simple mechanical reproduction. They asked, and rightly so, where is the hand of the artist? Now, Impressionist art, with its coarse brushstrokes and creative capture of light, clearly showed the hand of the artist. But both the public and the critics rejected Impressionism because they thought its painting technique was unrefined and its subject matter vulgar. Too many common street people, peasants, prostitutes, and scenes of bordello and cafes. By the 1890s, however, Impressionism was on a roll, with huge sales in France and the United States. By the 1920s, the Impressionists' influence on photography was evident in photos like these. Street photographers like André Kertész, Brassai, Robert Doisneau, and Henri Cartier-Bresson became Impressionists with cameras. Their photographs captured both the image and its meaning. In my opinion, the best street photos, like Manet's street paintings, capture something eternal and archetypal about people. The best are not posed but spontaneous. Because the scene changes so rapidly, capturing it with a camera is difficult. By contrast, painting is much easier in the sense that the moment on the canvas is a mixture of remembered impressions distilled into one image. So painting can teach the street photographer how to see. If you look at enough paintings, you will learn to see your best shot, because the painter has done the hard work for you. Look at the painting closely and you will see all the painter remembers, distilled into one image. It's that distilled moment of meaning the street photographer is also looking for. Street paintings teach us what the decisive moment looks like. So how did Manet paint those decisive moments? I'll give you a hint. He did it with the human gaze. Born in 1832, Manet developed as a painter the usual way, by copying other artists' paintings and by attending art classes. As he matured, Manet liked to say, "I paint what I see," exactly what photographer Cartier-Bresson would call the decisive moment. Look at Manet's 1863 painting, Luncheon on the Grass. Here is a decisive moment, if there ever was one. The scene is the Bois de Boulogne, a favorite trysting spot in Paris where lovers could have sex in the woods. We can imagine Manet walking by and surprising the lovers. The woman reacts and scandalously looks directly at him, not away. Keep in mind that in the 19th century, most viewers of painted nudes like not to be stared at. But here the woman breaks the rules and gazes right at Manet. The painting also reveals that proper Parisian males do in fact make love in public. So, scandal, scandal. Easy to see why Luncheon on the Grass didn't make it into the prestigious Salon exhibition of 1863. Just too much rule breaking. The same year, Manet broke the rules again. The painting this time was called Olympia. It comes out of a long tradition of painting reclining nudes, but there were rules. Manet captured a moment, all right, but the gaze was simply unacceptable to the public and the critics. The model looks at us without a hint of shame. The Salon judges grudgingly accepted this painting, but it hurt Manet's career. The public thought Olympia was too brazen, all because of that gaze of shameless indifference. They thought that she should at least look away or demur somehow. Manet, rule stretcher, boundary pusher, left town for a while to let things cool off. He fled to London, but eventually returned to his beloved Paris. His friend, poet Charles Baudelaire, also an art critic, supported Manet and used his influence to turn public and critical favor back toward his friend. There was good reason for the poet's support. Baudelaire knew Manet could teach artists how to paint what the poet liked to call modern life. The painting of modern life was going to be the next big thing in art, if Baudelaire had anything to do with it. So let's take a look at how these two men came to see eye to eye on a new and modern direction for painting. How did Baudelaire originate the idea of modern life and lay the groundwork for street painting and eventually for street photography? The movement we call Impressionism originated in France in the middle of the 19th century. Several artists were responsible, and Baudelaire and Manet formed a germ from which it grew. But neither man would ever call themselves Impressionists or claim to have started Impressionism. Instead, they simply wanted artists to paint real life as seen on the streets, not scenes of classical mythology and history. Baudelaire also had a flair for scandal. Frank descriptions of sex in his poetry Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, appalled his readers and led to legal action against him. But by the end of his life, the bulk of his writing was not poetry, but art criticism. Even in his critical essays, Baudelaire, like Manet, relished controversy. Published in 1863, during Manet's Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia scandals, Baudelaire's essay was called The Painter of Modern Life. In it, Baudelaire asked artists to stop painting history, landscapes, and mythology in their studios, but get outside and paint what he called modern life. But what exactly did he mean by modern life? Manet understood it perfectly. Modern life was life as actually lived on the streets of Paris, in its bordellos and cafes. To paint modern life, artists would have to get out onto the street with a discerning eye, a shameless mind, and a sketchbook. Baudelaire understood that once artists turned their senses to the city's noise, sex, chaos, and profusion of color and forms, they would be hooked. Over his career, Manet eventually became the painter of modern life Baudelaire wanted him to become, but Baudelaire did not live to see him do it. At the time of his essay, Baudelaire used another painter as an example of his modern life ideal. It was a good choice because the public was already well acquainted with this man. So who was Baudelaire's painter of modern life? In his essay, Baudelaire only names him as Monsieur G, but we know him today as Constantin Guise, an illustrator and artist for Parisian newspapers. Guise was Baudelaire's founding father of street painting. With Guise, we can see the beginning of a democratic art with images of nobility, bourgeoisie, military officers, shop workers, and prostitutes. Here is Baudelaire's description of Guise, along with a sample of the painter's work. To begin to understand Monsieur G, the first thing to note is that curiosity may be considered the starting point of his genius. The crowd is his domain, just as the air is the birds and the water that of the fish. His passion and his profession are to merge with the crowd. For the perfect idler, for the passionate observer, it becomes an immense source of enjoyment to establish his dwelling in the throng, in the ebb and flow, the bustle, the fleeting and the infinite, to be away from home and yet to feel at home anywhere, to see the world, to be at the very center of the world and yet to be unseen of the world. Such are some of the minor pleasures of those independent, intense, and impartial spirits. And so, walking or quickening his pace, he goes his way forever in search. But in search of what? We may rest assured that this man, such as I have described him, this solitary mortal, endowed with an active imagination, always roaming the great desert of men, has a nobler aim than that of the pure idler, a more general aim, other than the fleeting pleasure of circumstance. He is looking for that indefinable something we may be allowed to call modern life. Charles Baudelaire. The French have a great word for a person who wanders the street for no apparent reason. They call him a flâneur. English translations of flâneur are usually things like layabout, idler, and goof-off. But these are far from what Baudelaire meant by the term. A better meaning for Baudelaire would be truffle snuffer, for interesting street images, an active, inquisitive walker with eyes wide open, and an ambler with no particular destination in mind. A true flâneur might start out from home and 3 hours later find himself in an unknown part of town. Above all, a flâneur is incognito. Without revealing his intentions, the flâneur strolls with childlike naivete and absorbs what Baudelaire called modern life. Modern life for Baudelaire was not what you might think. It wasn't things like the new railroads or the spacious tree-lined boulevards replacing the quaint narrow streets. Modern life was simply the culture of sex, with the erotic allure created by the latest fashions and the freewheeling bohemian lifestyle of the bordello and cafe society. Modern life was about the consumerism of desire, of all that was ephemeral and fleeting, and the prostitute was its vehicle. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec's drawings easily capture the spectacle of the prostitute clothed in the most erotic garments of seduction. Modern life was lived on the streets, in cafes and bawdy houses. Montmartre was its capital. But modern life was not just about fashion and frivolity. Modern life was really a vast denial industry fueled by sex and alcohol. Paris at mid-century was replete with venereal disease, foul streets, and abject poverty. According to one writer, Paris was an immense workshop of putrefaction. The gaiety of the cabaret was simply a commercial mask for the Parisian underbelly. Most Impressionists bought into the denial with paintings of the Gaieté Parisienne, the boating parties, and crowded cabaret dance floors. Manet's genius lies in his honest depiction of people exploited by the sexual commerce of modern life, and the middle and upper classes who exploited them. Edouard Manet was well established by the 1860s, and a media icon of the era, much like a movie star. By mid-century, he had attracted a following of younger men and women who eventually became the Impressionists. They met every week at the Café Gerbois for debate and that occasional bad-tempered argument. Here is a portrait by Henri Fantin-Latour of Manet seated in his studio, surrounded by his circle of friends. These friends would become the greatest painters of Impressionism. Manet would encourage them, but would never call himself an Impressionist. He had other plans. In another painting by Fantin-Latour, here is Manet, the quintessential flaneur, all dressed for his walk. So get your walking stick, top hat, and comfortable shoes, and let's join Manet on his walk. By seeing what Manet sees, we will have a lesson in street photography. We've seen how the critics and the public heaped shame on Manet for Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia because the models had the wrong gaze. But the gaze was what Manet was all about. His street paintings teach us the power of the gaze to make an image iconic. Street photographers always hope to find that look, expression, or gaze that makes a shot special. Let's take a look at Manet's paintings to learn more about the human gaze. Manet's 1862 painting, Musical at the Tuileries Gardens, while a tour de force of technique, is still just a crowd scene. Aside from showing some of his friends, the image lacks any eye connection with the viewer. While faithful to Baudelaire's invitation to join the crowd, the painting can also be seen as a rejection of the crowd and its faceless anonymity. Manet's subsequent paintings were more about faces painted in the intimacy of small groups. To see how he did this, we need to follow him into the boudoir and the café. As modern street photographers, we must understand that Manet has not so much left the public space of the street as moved in to the communal space of the café and the commercial space of the prostitute's boudoir. For Manet, all these intimate spaces are public and fair game for the artist. Here we will see how he uses them to capture the power of the human gaze to reveal the people in the crowd. Manet seems to enjoy painting the female gaze. This gender-bending painting of his friend Victorine Moreau, his model for Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia, reveals a confident, cross-dressing matador with dagger eyes. Manet's work challenges us as street photographers to go beyond simply cataloging colorful characters we find on the street. Our photos should reflect our compassion. On one of his walks, Manet captured these two images of Parisian street people. Look at their gaze. You can feel Manet's empathy. Manet painted what their eyes disclosed about their thoughts and feelings. These paintings in the Art Institute of Chicago are life-size, and I believe Manet painted them this large so they would be noticed. As you walk into this section of the museum, you must confront these men. Our eyes cannot easily turn away. As we amble on, we see three serene figures eavesdropping from a balcony, casting that self-important gaze of the well-heeled bourgeoisie. But the common people, the prostitutes in the city's underbelly, working the cafes and bordellos, reveal their sadness and a numbness in their eyes. Leaning against the bar at the Folies Bergère, we see the beauty of the barmaid, but are chilled by her emotionless stare directed toward the male patron, seen on the right side reflected in the mirror. Across the room we spot a prostitute with her plum brandy, directing her gaze to make eye contact with a potential client. Her unlit cigarette beckons. Now back on the street, we pass a new Parisian railway station, the Gare Saint-Lazare, and spot a fashionable Victorine with her book and a sleeping puppy. The train gushes great billows of steam, attracting the little girl's attention. The gaze from the woman reveals only mild interest in us and in Manet, the flaneur. Down the street, a Spanish guitar player leaves work, eating cherries, while casting us an indifferent look. We enter a bistro, and Manet's eye immediately latches on to a conversation. The man's intense gaze at his companion arrests us. We agree he's in the act of seduction. These same scenes on the streets and in the cafes and bordellos, if shot with a camera, would make strong street photographs because they reveal the timelessness of the human condition. The paint artist is more fortunate because the subject's fleeting gaze is captured and retained in imagination and does not require snapping a camera shutter at precisely the right moment. Charles Baudelaire pushed artists toward the street, where he hoped they would find modern life as a new subject matter for their paintings. But for Manet, modern life was more than the consumerism of sex. Modern life was lived and should be painted from top to bottom. His paintings show destitute men begging on the street, middle classes in their fineries gazing down from balconies, and prostitutes whose inviting gaze summoned clients yet revealed their contempt. But some people we meet on the street show us a gaze that's archetypal and inspirational. Take, for example, Manet's striking portrait of his sister-in-law and fellow painter Berthe Morisot. Baudelaire may have had her in mind when he wrote this short prose poem, The Urge to Paint. I burn to paint her whom I glimpsed so briefly. Beautiful, more than beautiful, stunning. She is rich in black. All her inspirations are nocturnal and deep. Her eyes are two caverns in which mystery flickers vaguely, and her gaze flashes like lightning, an explosion in the dark. There are women who inspire the need to master and enjoy them, but she kindles the desire to die slowly, with her watching. Streets are sacred spaces of shadows and of light, of secret ambition, shame, and deep delight. I know your face will try to hide, but cannot when eyes betray what lies inside, of birth, of triumph, and of death. The street reveals it all beneath your pride.